Welcome, brave souls, to Fear File Chronicles, your one-way ticket to spine-chilling stories and terrifying tales. Tonight, we'll be diving into the darkest corners of the human mind with the story, Pitch, penned by the twisted mind of Locked 334. Together, we'll explore the unexplained and face our deepest fears. But before we begin, if you enjoy trembling in terror, be sure to hit that like button, share this video with your fellow fear fanatics, and subscribe to our channel. Don't forget to click the bell notification so you never miss an eerie episode. Your support truly means the world to us. So feel free to leave a comment below to join the Fear File Chronicles community. Now, without further ado, let's unravel the mysteries of the unknown together as we delve into tonight's fear-inducing story, Pitch. Dim the lights and prepare yourself for a chilling journey into the Fear File Chronicles. The clatter of metal on metal echoed down the hall as the cell door slammed shut. Richard Carver sank onto the skimpy cot, unfurling his bedroll across it. He buried his face in his hands, his pale skin becoming ghost-like in the cell's gloomy light. In a grim twist of fate, he found himself imprisoned, something he'd never have predicted. His own bitter mumbles filled the cold, hard room, recounting his foolish decision to drive home intoxicated from that party. He cursed his destiny and lamented the disappointment he'd brought to his family. The somber reverie was broken by a gruff voice from the shadows.
"So, how long you got, pal?"
The voice inquired, devoid of emotion. Raising his eyes from his hands, Richard met the gaze of his new cellmate. The man had dark, receding hair, with heavy bags shadowing his dim blue-gray eyes. A thick beard hung from his chin, and a disconcerting grin toyed at the corners of his mouth. Richard felt a chill down his spine. He couldn't trust this man. He recalled the rumors of the kind of people he might meet here, unsure of their veracity.
Not sure yet. Still awaiting the trial,"
Richard managed to utter. The stranger sat upright, slapping his hands onto his knees.
"Well, what did you do?"
He prodded.
"I was driving home from a party. Had a bit to drink, hit a car, and some people got hurt."
"Is that all?"
The man chuckled.
"Yeah, I don't really want to talk about it anymore."
Richard mumbled, starting to prepare his bed for sleep. The man laid back down, melting back into the shadows that covered his side of the bed.
"If you say so, but it gets lonely in here. You're gonna want to talk eventually,"
he murmured. A symphony of strange sounds filled the night, stealing Richard's sleep. When breakfast came, he could barely keep his eyes open, which didn't deter the guards from marching him down to the cafeteria. Shuffled through a line, he was handed a metal tray. Trying to decipher the unfamiliar mashup of food, he ended up copying the person ahead. As he dropped his tray onto an empty table, various inmates began to gather around their claimed territories. He felt a disconcerting glare each time he met the eyes of men sitting across from him. About to bite into a roll, a firm push against his shoulder interrupted him. Turning slowly, he found himself confronted by a heavily tattooed, towering figure. He quickly learned the hard way about the unspoken seating rules in the cafeteria.
"That's Bubba's seat. Remember that,"
snickered a smaller man standing by. Rising without a word, Richard moved to leave, much to the amusement of the other inmates. Before he could navigate around the giant, the smaller man knocked the tray from his hands, sending food scattering and laughter rippling through the room. He quietly retrieved his tray and returned it to be cleaned, then stood by the exit, awaiting his return to the cell. As he was ushered back into his cell, his cellmate emerged from the shadows again. Richard offered no response. He just sank back onto his bed, stomach growling. He tried to silence the embarrassing sound, which only amused his cellmate and made Richard feel worse. He held back tears, realizing he couldn't afford to appear weaker than he already had. His weakness could make him a target, and that was a risk he couldn't take.
"What's your name, anyway?"
Richard hesitated, unsure of how close he should get to anyone here.
It's Richard."
He finally stammered.
You might want to shorten that to Rick and stop acting like a priss, or you're going to keep having little altercations like that,
the man advised.
What do you know?
Richard retorted.
Well, I've been in here a long time, and I have seen a few things.
The man replied, his tone still holding an edge of mockery. Richard rolled over to face his cellmate.
So, what's your name then?
The man leaned in, grinning.
Folks call me Pitch.
Offering his hand for a shake. Richard returned the gesture. Pitch's grip was unexpectedly strong, and when Richard withdrew his hand, it felt as cold as ice. He rubbed his fingers, observing Pitch. He couldn't trust this man yet, but he acknowledged the potential benefit of having someone to converse with. Boredom could be his worst enemy here. Feigning a smile, Richard leaned back on his bed while Pitch returned to reading his book in silence. Later, during yard time, Richard walked past clusters of inmates, trying to stay aloof. Eyes followed him everywhere. Whispers spread like wildfire. Try as he might, he couldn't catch any words. But no one approached him. In fact, some men seemed to actively avoid him. It felt as if the entire yard was watching him, but he had no clue why. Just before lights out that night, guards stormed Richard's cell. They began rummaging through his belongings, claiming they were searching for contraband. Threats of solitary confinement echoed in the room if anything illicit was found. Nothing turned up in Richard's cot, but a sharpened toothbrush was discovered in Pitch's pillow stuffing. Richard was instantly handcuffed and led to confinement, pleading innocence all the way. He protested that the weapon wasn't his but belonged to Pitch. But his pleas fell on deaf ears as the guards laughed, and he was thrown into an even tinier cell. He pounded on the door, demanding release, but his cries went unanswered. The following day, Richard was escorted to a conference room. His attorney was waiting for him. They sat across from each other, the attorney well-dressed and serious. Without wasting time, Richard asked about the trial. That's when he learned the unsettling news. His trial date had been pushed back. Additional charges had been levied against him. Richard's eyes widened. He couldn't believe what he was hearing. Attempted murder of a fellow inmate, a man named Brian Bubba Wells. He vehemently denied the charges. It wasn't him, he insisted. It was Pitch, his cellmate. The guards had found the weapon in Pitch's bunk. He screamed. Yet they had thrown Richard into solitary. His attorney assured him of a thorough investigation. He would do his best to clear Richard's name. Later, when Richard was returned to his cell, he found Pitch. His cellmate was engrossed in another book. As Richard entered, Pitch looked up. The guards left, and Richard slowly took a seat across from Pitch. Anger and confusion swirled within him. Could Pitch really have stabbed Bubba? Would he do the same to Richard? Finally, Richard broke the silence.
Why'd you try to kill Bubba?
Pitch barely looked up from his book.
I don't like bullies,
Was his simple reply. Confused, Richard pressed on.
Why do they think I did it?
Pitch didn't seem concerned.
Haven't the foggiest,
He said, turning a page. Richard wanted more answers, but he knew they weren't coming. He turned away from Pitch and tried sleep. It was hard. The sound of pages rustling filled the silence of the cell. The noise seemed to grow louder the longer he lay awake. It echoed in his head, filling him with dread. Only when Pitch finally put down his book did Richard manage to doze off. His mind, however, was still a whirlwind of confusion. Weeks passed, and the rumors spread. Richard was branded as a monster within Cade County Prison. The rumors reached the ears of the guards. They decided to move Richard to D Block. B Block was notorious. It housed the worst criminals you could imagine. Pitch watched Richard leave their shared cell. His grin was sickly as he waved goodbye. Alone now, Richard was placed in a new cell. He was given a new bunk. An empty bunk sat across from him. Whispers and stares filled the air around him. Across the hall, a scrawny man called out.
Hey, you.
Richard barely responded.
Did you really kill your last cellmate?
No, and I didn't stab Bubba.
Richard retorted, irritated. The man smirked.
That's not what I've heard.
He said, seemingly satisfied with his own ignorance. Richard had no patience for him.
You shouldn't believe everything you hear,
he said before laying down. Later, in the quiet of his dark cell, Richard heard a noise. It sounded like a dripping faucet. He checked the sink, but it was dry. He checked the commode, but the water was still. Suddenly, Pitch was there. He pinned Richard to the bed. Richard screamed for help, but no one came. Pitch smiled and leaned closer. A dark fluid dripped from Pitch's face, falling onto Richard's. Suddenly, Pitch's mouth opened. A flood of black fluid poured out, covering Richard. Richard tumbled from his bunk, gasping for breath. He looked around, but Pitch was gone. There was no trace of the black fluid either. Richard asked the other inmates about Pitch, but they dismissed him. Confused and scared, Richard returned to his bunk. He tried to convince himself it was a nightmare. Still, the terrifying memory kept him awake. The next day, in the mess hall, Richard saw a group of men. They were harassing a new inmate. Something inside Richard snapped. He couldn't just stand by and watch. He took action. He attacked the men. He defended the new inmate. The fear in the man's eyes subsided, replaced with gratitude. As Richard turned to leave, he felt a strange sensation. Something was trickling from his nose. It was the same black fluid. Back in his cell, he found a book on his pillow. Pitch's book. He picked it up and opened it. Another drop of black fluid fell from his nose, splattering on the blank page. He flipped through the book, but every page was blank. Returning to the first page, he saw something shocking. His actions in the mess hall were detailed there, in vivid detail. Situations continued to occur that Richard couldn't seem to avoid being drawn into. His body instinctively interfered, and each time his nose would bleed black. Every time, it would be added to the book. This had become a hobby to keep him entertained within his lonely cell. Richard would smile as he watched the inky liquid move independently. It formed words upon the page in a neatly scrawled cursive. It didn't take long to fill 10 pages. He would read them over and over again before the guards would signal for lights out. Eventually, his actions led to a transfer to a maximum security prison. Cade County could no longer tolerate his violent nature and handed him over to the federal prison system. As he settled into his new cell, he noticed that he was once again alone. Richard began to feel as though they didn't trust him in a small space with another person. He flipped through the pages again, having filled half the book. He wondered what would happen when he reached the end. Would the pages revert to blank, and he would start all over? Or would he need a new book? He pondered this as men within his cell block began making obscene gestures in his direction. A sinister smile played on his lips, just thinking of the words that would fill his little diary of destruction. Within 6 months, he had made a new name for himself and would be serving 7 consecutive life sentences. Richard no longer cared. He just wanted to keep filling his book. It had become an obsession. He would sit quietly in his room, reading from it until he had an opportunity to strike again and add another page. Richard wanted nothing more than to see what happened when he got to the last page. He did everything he could to reach that goal quickly. He simply had to know the result. His thoughts were interrupted by the door to his cell opening and being gestured to exit for yard time. He smiled, knowing this was an opportunity to add another page or two. When he returned, new pages awaited to be filled after he stabbed 2 gang members with a makeshift knife fashioned from aluminum foil. He took a seat on his bunk and slid back into the shadow that covered it. Then he opened his book and let the black droplets add to his growing journal. The cell door opened again, a new inmate being placed on the bunk next to him. Richard was scanning over the newly formed words as the man sat his bedroll down. Richard looked up over his pages, seeing that the man seemed far more dangerous than he. The man laughed at the sight of Richard.
So, this is the monster I keep hearing about?
The man laughed. Richard smiled and turned the book to a fresh page.
It sure is,
he said without looking up.
You don't look like much of a monster to me. What's your name anyway? Probably something nerdy like Bill or Bob. Maybe even Richard?
The man leaned forward, laughing while bits of saliva sprayed Richard's face. Richard thought for a moment, his anger boiling up inside of him. Then a drop of the dark liquid fell to the page and formed large letters that read pitch.
Pitch,
He said quietly.
Did you say bitch? I think he just said his name is bitch.
The man yelled out to the cell block, the men around them cowering from the commotion.
I said pitch.
Richard growled as he rose from his bunk, the dark liquid flowing more rapidly from his nose and eyes.
What the?
The man said as Richard drew closer. A few moments later, guards came rushing in to find Richard crumpled on the floor, and the new inmate sitting on his bunk, flipping through a tiny black book. They revived Richard and took him to the infirmary to check him for injuries. All of his tests came back fine, and he would be allowed to go back to his cell. That is, after he spoke with his attorney who was waiting for him in the conference room. The guards directed him to the room and placed him just across the table, still shackled for the protection of everyone within the room.
I'm sorry to inform you that we are going to lose your case.
His lawyer said with a sigh.
The evidence against you is just too strong. I think you're going to get charged for murder again, Richard.
Murder? What are you talking about? I've never killed anyone.
Richard cried, tears flowing from his eyes.
It had to have been pitch.
The lawyer rubbed at his eyes, frustrated.
That's what you said the first time, Mr. Carver, but your actions within the penal system prove different. Plus, neither this facility nor Cade County has any record of an inmate by that name or nickname. I even looked up the description you gave, and it doesn't fit anyone here.
This is impossible. It can't be. I haven't killed anyone.
Richard yelled, his hand slamming on the table. The attorney jumped at the action, fear rising up in him.
I'm sorry, Mr. Carver. There's nothing more I can do for you,
he said as he quickly gathered his things and rushed from the room. Well, my friends, we've reached the end of tonight's chilling tale, Pitch, by the talented Locked 334. I hope you've enjoyed our descent into darkness and that you'll carry a piece of the Fear File Chronicles with you as you drift into uneasy dreams. If our story left you shivering and shaking, don't forget to like this video, share it with others who crave a good scare, and subscribe to the Fear File Chronicles for more haunting horrors. Remember to hit the bell notification so you're always among the first to know when a new nightmare awaits. As always, we appreciate your support and would love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Sharing your fears and frights with us truly means a lot, so don't be shy to engage with our sinister community. Until next time, remember to embrace the darkness, for it is within the shadows that our most terrifying stories are born. Good night, and stay scared.